The wind howled through the alley as Jessika pressed her back against the icy brick wall, one hand clutching the swelling bruise along her jaw. The last gift Caleb had given her before she ran. Each gust cut through her thin jacket like frozen blades, but the cold was nothing compared to the fire of rage still burning in her husband's voice somewhere behind her. "You think you can run from me?" His words echoed off the narrow walls, growing closer. "Just until morning," she whispered to herself, the words becoming a desperate prayer, the pain in her ribs where his boot had connected. Just until morning. The taste of blood from her split lip. Just until morning. The terror that made her hands shake so violently she could barely grip the car keys she'd grabbed from their kitchen table. At least that's what she told herself. She stumbled deeper into the shadows, her bare feet numb against the wet pavement. 3 years of marriage had taught her to move silently, to make herself small, to disappear. The woman who used to laugh freely, who used to fight back, was buried somewhere beneath layers of fear and carefully applied makeup. Tonight, even the makeup couldn't hide what he'd done. Her fingers found the car key in her pocket, and hope flickered in her chest. Caleb's old Honda had to be parked somewhere in this maze of service alleys behind their apartment building. If she could just reach it, drive somewhere safe, maybe she could finally. The sound of footsteps on wet concrete made her freeze. Heavy boots. Getting closer. She spotted the dark silhouette of a car 20 feet away and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged animal. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and she dove into the back seat, pulling the door shut just as Caleb's shadow appeared at the mouth of the alley. The interior smelled different than she remembered. Expensive leather instead of stale cigarettes, clean instead of the perpetual scent of Caleb's anger, but there was no time to think about it. She curled herself into the smallest possible shape behind the driver's seat, pressing her face against the cool leather, and held her breath. The engine started. Her blood turned to ice as she realized her mistake. This wasn't Caleb's car. Through the gap between the seats, she caught a glimpse of hands on the steering wheel, strong, steady hands wearing an expensive watch. In the rearview mirror, a pair of cold blue eyes met hers. The man behind the wheel didn't shout, didn't demand explanations. He simply studied her reflection for a long moment, taking in her bruised face and terrified eyes before speaking in a voice like winter itself. "Who are you running from? Malishka." Subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story unfolds darker, deeper, and far more dangerous than you think. Now, let's begin the tale. The stranger's question hung in the air between us as the car pulled away from the alley, away from Caleb's searching voice, away from everything I'd ever known. I should have been terrified, and I was. But as those blue eyes continued to watch me in the mirror, I realized that for the first time in 3 years, someone was asking me a question instead of telling me what to do. "My husband," I whispered, the words scraping against my throat like broken glass. "He'll kill me if he finds me." The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. His hands remained steady on the wheel as we glided through the empty streets, the city lights blurring past like fallen stars. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Then it's a good thing you chose the right car tonight." I pressed myself deeper into the leather seat, trying to make sense of what was happening. The interior of this car cost more than Caleb made in a year. The man driving wore a suit that probably cost more than our rent. Everything about this situation screamed danger, yet something in his calm demeanor made my racing heart slow, just a fraction. "Where are you taking me?" I managed to ask. "Somewhere safe." He took a turn onto a tree-lined street I didn't recognize. "What's your name?" "Jessika." The truth slipped out before I could stop it. 3 years of Caleb's paranoia had taught me to lie reflexively, but this stranger's quiet authority seemed to pull honesty from me like a magnet. "Jessika." He repeated my name like he was testing how it felt. "I'm Victor." Through the partition, I caught glimpses of his profile. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved from stone, dark hair swept back with military precision. He looked like the kind of man who had never begged for anything in his life. The opposite of everything Caleb had become. We drove in silence through increasingly upscale neighborhoods until the car turned through massive iron gates. The mansion that rose before us looked like something from a movie. All clean lines and glowing windows, surrounded by manicured grounds that stretched into darkness. Security cameras tracked our movement, and I spotted at least 2 men in dark suits positioned near the entrance. My stomach dropped. "What is this place?" "My home." Victor parked the car and finally turned to look at me directly. Up close, his eyes were the color of winter sky, beautiful and utterly cold. "You have a choice, Jessika. I can have my driver take you to a women's shelter, or you can come inside, get cleaned up, rest, decide what you want to do next." I stared at him, searching for the catch. Men like Caleb always had conditions, always demanded payment for their kindness. But Victor simply waited, his expression unreadable. "Why would you help me?" Something flickered across his features, too quick to interpret. "Because you asked." The car door opened, and a man in a dark suit extended his hand to help me out. Hesitated, looking back at Victor one more time. He was already reaching for his phone, dismissing me from his attention as easily as he'd offered his protection. "Dmitri will show you to a room," he said without looking up. "There are clothes in the closet, food in the kitchen. The door locks from the inside." I climbed out on shaking legs, following Dmitri up marble steps that gleamed like ice under the security lights. The front door was solid oak, carved with intricate patterns that probably had some meaning I'd never understand. Everything about this place whispered of power and money and secrets. As we crossed the threshold, I caught my reflection in a massive mirror hanging in the foyer. The woman staring back looked like a ghost, hollow-eyed, bruised, wearing clothes that hung off her frame like rags. I looked exactly like what I was, a victim who had stumbled into a world far beyond her understanding. Dmitri led me up a sweeping staircase to a guest room that was larger than the entire apartment I'd shared with Caleb. The bed was made with crisp white linens, and French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking the grounds. On the dresser sat a tray with sandwiches, fruit, and a bottle of water. "Mr. Krylov thought you might be hungry," Dmitri said in accented English. "The bathroom is through there, clean towels, soap, whatever you need." He left me alone, and I heard the soft click of the lock engaging, but when I tested the handle, it turned easily. He'd been telling the truth. I could lock it from the inside, but I wasn't trapped. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my body finally registering the adrenaline crash. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the water bottle. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, each drop a tiny reminder of the storm I'd just escaped. But as I sat in that beautiful room, surrounded by luxury I'd never dreamed of, one thought kept circling through my mind. Victor Krylov hadn't asked me to explain myself, hadn't demanded to know what I'd done to deserve Caleb's fists, hadn't suggested that maybe if I tried harder, loved better, submitted more completely, my husband wouldn't need to hurt me. He'd simply asked who I was running from, and when I told him, he'd driven me somewhere safe. I pulled the soft throw blanket around my shoulders and stared out at the rain, wondering what kind of man had the power to make promises like that, and whether I was brave enough to find out. I woke to silence. Not the kind of silence I'd grown accustomed to in my marriage. The brittle quiet that preceded Caleb's explosions, heavy with unspoken threats. This was different, complete, as if the world had been wrapped in velvet and all its sharp edges smoothed away. Sunlight streamed through the French doors, casting geometric patterns across marble floors, so pristine they looked like mirrors. I sat up slowly, my body protesting every movement. The bruises Caleb had left were deeper than I'd realized, painting my ribs in shades of purple and yellow that bloomed like poisonous flowers beneath my skin. The guest room looked even more opulent in daylight. Everything was cream and gold, from the silk curtains to the ornate molding that crowned the ceiling. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, each facet catching the morning light and scattering rainbows across the walls. It was beautiful. It was also a cage, no matter how gilded. I padded to the window and looked out over the grounds. The estate stretched for what had to be acres, surrounded by walls topped with decorative ironwork that I now realized served a more practical purpose. Security cameras tracked slowly back and forth, and I counted at least 4 men in dark suits positioned at various points around the property. They moved with the fluid precision of soldiers, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. A soft knock interrupted my surveillance. "Miss Jessika?" A woman's voice, accented but warm. "Mr. Krylov asks if you would join him for breakfast." I opened the door to find a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen everything and judged nothing. "I'm Elena," she said, offering a gentle smile. "I manage the household. Mr. Krylov thought you might prefer women's clothing." She gestured to a garment bag hanging on her arm. "These should fit." Inside the bag were clothes that probably cost more than I'd made in months. Soft cashmere sweaters, well-tailored jeans, undergarments still bearing designer tags. Everything in my size, as if Victor had somehow cataloged my measurements with a single glance. "How did he—" "Mr. Krylov is very observant," Elena said simply. "The breakfast room is downstairs, second door on the left. Take your time." She left me alone with the clothes and my growing unease. How had he known my size so precisely? What else had he observed during our brief encounter? I dressed quickly in dark jeans and a cream sweater that felt like wearing a cloud, then made my way downstairs. The mansion revealed itself in layers as I walked through it. Marble gave way to rich hardwood. Abstract art hung alongside what looked like priceless antiques. And everywhere there was this sense of money so old and established, it had transcended mere wealth and become power itself. But beneath the luxury, I felt eyes tracking my movement. Staff members who nodded politely but watched too carefully. Security cameras that followed my progress through the halls. I found the breakfast room exactly where Elena had said it would be. Victor sat at a mahogany table that could have seated 12, reading what looked like financial reports while sipping coffee from bone china. He'd traded his suit for dark slacks and a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. Even in casual clothes, he radiated the kind of authority that made people step aside without being asked. He looked up as I entered, those winter blue eyes taking in my appearance with the same clinical assessment I'd noticed the night before. "Good morning, Jessika. I trust you slept well?" "Yes, thank you." I hovered near the doorway, uncertain whether I was a guest or a prisoner. "Sit." It wasn't quite a command, but it wasn't a request either. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Elena makes excellent coffee. You look like you could use some." I sat carefully, hyper-aware of every movement. The chair was positioned so that morning light fell across my face, illuminating the bruises I'd tried to cover with makeup. Victor's expression didn't change as he took in the damage, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. "Tell me about your husband," he said, pouring coffee into a second cup with steady hands. The directness of the question caught me off guard. "What do you want to know?" "The truth." He slid the cup across the table to me. "All of it." So I told him. About Caleb's charm in the beginning, how he'd swept me off my feet with grand gestures and passionate declarations, about the slow erosion that followed, the way he'd isolated me from friends, convinced me to quit my job, made me dependent on him for everything, about the first time he'd hit me, how he'd cried afterward and sworn it would never happen again, about the escalation that followed, the broken bones he'd explained away as accidents, the police reports that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Victor listened without interruption, his face a mask of polite attention. He might have been hearing a weather report for all the emotion he showed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying the contents of his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions I couldn't fathom. "You tried to leave before," he said finally. 3 times. The admission tasted like failure. He always found me, always brought me back. "And the police?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They said it was a domestic matter. Suggested counseling. One officer told me that maybe if I tried harder to be a good wife, my husband wouldn't need to discipline me." Something flickered across Victor's features. Too quick to interpret, but it made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "You think I'm a savior," he said finally, setting down his cup with deliberate precision. "But I don't save people, Jessika. I remove problems." The words sent ice through my veins. There was something in the way he said it, casual, matter-of-fact, that made me believe he'd done exactly that before, many times. "What does that mean?" "It means you have a choice to make." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those unreadable eyes. "You can stay here until you figure out what you want to do next. My staff will see to your needs, and you'll be safe from your husband. Or I can have my men escort you to a women's shelter where you can start over properly. And if I stay, then you stay. No conditions, no expectations, just time and space to heal." I searched his face for the catch, the hidden price that men like him always demanded. But Victor simply waited, as patient as stone. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because," he said, rising from his chair with fluid grace, "everyone deserves the chance to choose their own cage." He left me alone with my coffee and my racing thoughts. Through the window, I could see his men moving across the grounds with their careful precision, and I wondered what kind of problems Victor Krylov removed, and what methods he used to remove them. But as I sat in that beautiful room, surrounded by luxury and protection I'd never dreamed possible, I realized something that should have terrified me. I didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not out of trust. I wasn't naive enough for that. But out of exhaustion so bone deep that even a devil's bargain looked like salvation. I stayed. 3 days in Victor's house taught me that luxury was just another kind of camouflage. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Wealthy, yes, but normal. Elena brought me meals on fine china. The housekeeping staff moved through the halls with quiet efficiency. Victor himself seemed to spend most of his time in what Elena called the office, handling what she described as business matters with the same detached professionalism he'd shown me. But I'd learned to notice things. 3 years with Caleb had taught me to read the spaces between words, to catalog the small details that revealed the truth beneath polite facades. And the truth of Victor's world was written in a language I was only beginning to understand. The guards, for instance. Elena called them security, but they moved like soldiers, back straight, eyes constantly scanning, hands that rested too close to concealed weapons. They communicated in brief nods and subtle hand signals, a silent choreography that spoke of military training and serious threats. When they thought I wasn't looking, I caught glimpses of earpieces and the telltale bulge of shoulder holsters beneath their tailored jackets. Then there were the phones. Victor carried 3 of them. A sleek smartphone for what appeared to be legitimate business. A second device that never left his person, and a third that he used for conversations conducted entirely in rapid Russian. The encrypted phones, I realized, watching him switch between them with practiced ease. The kind of devices that suggested communications too sensitive for normal channels. The staff spoke in code around him. The shipment from Chicago, instead of naming what was being shipped. The meeting with our associates, rather than identifying who those associates might be. Handling the situation in the warehouse district without specifying what kind of situation required handling. Every conversation was a puzzle, with missing pieces, and I was beginning to suspect those missing pieces would terrify me. Even the house itself revealed its secrets gradually. The basement level that required a key card to access. The room on the 2nd floor that was always locked, with soundproofing visible around the door frame. The way certain areas went silent when I approached, conversations cutting off mid-sentence as if my presence triggered some unspoken protocol. Victor ran his world like a military operation, efficient, silent, precise. Orders were given once and followed without question. Information flowed upward through carefully maintained channels. Everyone had a role, a rank, a specific function in the larger machine, and at the center of it all sat Victor himself, calm and controlled, making decisions with the kind of authority that came from absolute power. I should have been terrified. Instead, I found myself fascinated. On my 4th night, I discovered just how deep the shadows in this house really went. I'd been having trouble sleeping. Too many years of hypervigilance to simply switch off because I was safe. Around midnight, I gave up on rest and padded downstairs to the kitchen for warm milk, a habit from childhood that sometimes helped quiet my racing mind. The house felt different at night, larger somehow, full of spaces that seemed to breathe with their own life. Security lights cast geometric patterns through the windows, and I could see guards making their rounds across the grounds with military precision. I was heating milk on the stove when voices drifted from Victor's office, the door slightly ajar, spilling light into the darkened hallway. I should have returned to my room, should have respected his privacy, but something in the tone of the conversation made me freeze. You're letting a stranger into our walls. A woman's voice sharp with disapproval. What if she's bait? She's not bait. Victor's response was calm, matter of fact. She's broken. The words hit me like a physical blow. Broken. As if I were a damaged piece of machinery, something to be pitied rather than protected. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering as the conversation continued. Broken can be dangerous, the woman replied. I caught a glimpse of her through the crack in the door, tall, elegant, with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe chignon. She moved with the same predatory grace I'd noticed in Victor's guards. Broken people do desperate things. Nadia. Victor's voice carried a warning. I've made my decision. And if you're wrong, if she brings her problems to our door, then we'll handle it the way we handle all problems. The casual certainty in his voice made my blood run cold. I backed away from the door, my bare feet silent on the marble floor, and fled upstairs before I could hear any more. But sleep was impossible after that. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, turning Victor's words over in my mind. She's broken. Not hurt, not traumatized, not recovering. Broken, like something that might never work properly again. The next morning, I found him in the garden. He was sitting on a stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree, reading what looked like financial reports while drinking coffee from a thermos. The morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and for a moment he looked almost peaceful, almost normal. You heard, he said without looking up from his papers. I hadn't made a sound approaching, but somehow he'd known I was there. Yes, and now you're angry. I'm not broken. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. I'm not some damaged thing that needs to be fixed. He set down his papers and looked at me directly, those winter blue eyes studying my face with the same clinical assessment I'd grown accustomed to. No. No. I crossed my arms, suddenly aware that I was wearing one of the expensive sweaters he'd provided, standing in his garden, eating his food, sleeping under his protection. But I couldn't let it go. I survived. That's not the same thing as being broken. Survival and wholeness aren't mutually exclusive, he said quietly, but they're not the same thing either. So what am I then, in your expert opinion? Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that perfect control. You're someone who's been systematically dismantled by a man who should have protected you. Someone who's learned to make herself small, to anticipate violence, to accept cruelty as love. He paused, his gaze never leaving mine. That's not your fault, Jessika, but it is damage. The truth of it hit harder than any of Caleb's fists ever had, because he was right. I had been dismantled, piece by piece, until I barely recognized myself. The woman who used to laugh freely, who used to fight back, who used to believe she deserved better. Where had she gone? Broken things can be rebuilt, Victor continued, his voice gentler now, if they're handled carefully. I stared at him, this man who spoke of violence as casually as other people discussed the weather, who surrounded himself with armed guards and encrypted phones, who made people disappear when they became problems. And yet here he was, offering me something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Why? I whispered. Why do you care what happens to me? For a moment, something raw flickered across his features. Pain, maybe, or regret. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Because, he said, returning to his papers, everyone deserves the chance to be whole again. I left him there in the garden, but his words followed me back into the house. As I climbed the marble stairs to my room, I caught a glimpse of Nadia watching me from the shadows of the hallway. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her posture suggested she was reassessing me, calculating whether I was worth the risk Victor was taking. I wondered what conclusion she'd reach. More importantly, I wondered what would happen to me if she decided I wasn't. What I didn't know, what Victor had carefully kept from me, was that my presence in his house wasn't the random act of kindness it appeared to be. 3 days earlier, his people had completed a thorough investigation of Caleb Faust. They'd uncovered his employment history, his associates, his connection to Marcus Webb, a small-time arms dealer who'd been cutting into Victor's territory for months. The irony wasn't lost on Victor. The woman who'd stumbled into his car, fleeing from an abusive husband, was married to a man who worked for one of his competitors. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor. But as he sat in his garden, watching Jessika disappear into the house, Victor found himself hoping that fate also had a sense of justice. Because Caleb Faust had made a very serious mistake when he'd raised his hand to the woman now under Victor's protection, and Victor Krylov never let mistakes go unpunished. A week in Victor's house had given me something I'd almost forgotten existed: peace, not happiness. I wasn't naive enough to confuse safety with joy, but for the first time in 3 years, I woke each morning without immediately cataloging potential threats. I ate meals without calculating escape routes. I moved through spaces without flinching at sudden sounds or unexpected movements. The bruises on my face had faded to yellow shadows. The split in my lip had healed. Elena had taken me shopping for clothes that actually fit, and I'd caught glimpses of the woman I used to be in dressing room mirrors, still too thin, still too careful, but alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I was reading in the library when my old life came crashing back. The book was Jane Eyre, fitting, considering my circumstances, and I was lost in the familiar rhythm of Bronte's prose when I heard it. A soft buzz from across the room, coming from the small purse I'd carried the night I ran. I'd barely touched it since arriving, too focused on the present to examine the remnants of my past. The sound came again, insistent, electronic. My blood turned to ice as I realized what it was. A phone, but not my phone. I'd thrown that in a dumpster 3 blocks from the apartment, knowing Caleb could track it. This was something else, something I'd never seen before. With trembling hands, I opened the purse and found a cheap burner phone tucked beneath my old wallet. The screen showed a single text message from an unknown number. "I found you." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the library like a gunshot, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around me, the beautiful room transforming into a trap. He'd found me. Somehow, impossibly, Caleb had found me. I sank to my knees, my body remembering every lesson he'd taught me about pain. The way his fist felt when it connected with my ribs, the sound his belt made when he pulled it from its loops, the particular quality of silence that preceded his worst rages. How? The question circled through my mind like a vulture. How had he gotten a phone into my bag? How had he tracked me here? How long had he been watching, waiting, planning? "Jessika." Victor's voice cut through my panic like a blade. I looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp concern as he took in my state. In 3 quick strides, he was beside me, his hands gentle but firm as he helped me to my feet. "What happened?" I couldn't speak, could barely think. I just pointed at the phone lying on the floor, its screen still glowing with Caleb's message. Victor picked it up, his face going completely still as he read the text. For a moment, the mask of control he always wore slipped, and I saw something that made my blood freeze. Fury so pure and cold it was like looking into the heart of a glacier. "How long has this been in your bag?" His voice was deadly quiet. "I don't know. I didn't know it was there." He was already moving, pulling his own phone from his pocket and speaking in rapid Russian. I caught fragments, orders, locations, names I didn't recognize. Within seconds, the library filled with his men. Dmitri appeared first, followed by 2 others I'd seen patrolling the grounds. "Lock down the house," Victor commanded, switching to English. "Full security protocol. I want every camera checked, every entrance monitored, and find out how long that phone has been active." "Sir." Dmitri nodded and began speaking into his earpiece. Victor turned back to me, his expression softening slightly. "Jessika, I need you to think. When did you last go through your bag thoroughly?" "The night I ran." My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. I just grabbed it and... The realization hit me like a physical blow. He put it there, before I left. He knew I would run, and he wanted to be able to find me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victor's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the promise of violence. "He won't touch you again." The words were steel wrapped in silk, and I believed them completely. But belief didn't stop the terror clawing at my chest, the memories flooding back like poison in my veins. "He's coming," I whispered. "He always comes. Let him." Victor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'll be waiting." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Victor's house transformed from a peaceful estate into a fortress. Additional guards appeared as if from nowhere, taking positions around the property with military precision. Security cameras were adjusted, motion sensors calibrated, escape routes planned and rehearsed. I watched it all from the safety of the library, feeling like a spectator at my own execution. Victor moved through his domain with calm efficiency, issuing orders and receiving reports with the detached professionalism of a general preparing for war. But I caught glimpses of something else beneath the surface, a cold rage that made the air around him seem to vibrate with potential violence. "The phone was activated 6 days ago," Dmitri reported during one of their briefings. "He's been tracking her location since she arrived." 6 days. Caleb had known where I was for almost a week, had been watching and waiting while I'd foolishly allowed myself to feel safe. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound he'd ever given me. "Any movement on his end?" Victor asked. "Our contacts in the police department report he filed a missing persons report yesterday. Claims his wife was kidnapped." Victor's laugh was devoid of humor. "Clever. Establishing a narrative in case things go badly for him." He paused, considering. "What else do we know about him?" "Marcus Webb's operation is small but growing. Caleb Faust handles enforcement, collections, intimidation, the occasional disappearance. He's violent but undisciplined. More useful as a blunt instrument than a strategist." I listened to them discuss my husband like he was a business problem to be solved, and part of me was grateful for their clinical detachment. But another part, the part that had loved him once, before he'd systematically destroyed that love, felt sick at how easily they reduced him to a collection of threats and weaknesses. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. The wind against the windows, the settling of the old house, the distant murmur of guards making their rounds. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for Caleb's face to appear at the window or his voice to echo through the halls. When I finally drifted off near dawn, the nightmares came immediately. I was back in our apartment, but it was wrong somehow. The walls stretched impossibly high, the rooms connected in ways that defied logic. Caleb was hunting me through the maze of corridors, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "You can't hide from me, Jessika. You're mine. You'll always be mine." I ran through endless hallways, my bare feet slipping on floors that seemed to shift beneath me. Behind me, his footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sound of his belt sliding through its loops, the prelude to punishment I knew by heart. "Found you." His hand closed around my wrist, and I screamed, "Jessika!" I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The room was dark except for the security lights filtering through the curtains, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, couldn't separate dream from reality. Then I saw him. Victor stood near the window, perfectly still, watching me with those winter blue eyes. He was fully dressed despite the early hour, and something in his posture suggested he'd been there for a while. "You were dreaming," he said quietly. I sat up, pulling the blanket around myself like armor. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough." He moved closer, and I caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and understated that somehow made me feel safer. "You called out his name?" Shame flooded through me. Even in sleep, even here in Victor's fortress, Caleb still had power over me. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize." Victor's voice was gentle but firm. "Fear is a reasonable response to a real threat." "But you said he couldn't touch me." "He can't." The certainty in his voice was absolute. But that doesn't erase what he's already done. Healing takes time. I studied his face in the dim light, searching for some sign of impatience or judgment. But Victor simply waited, as patient as stone, until I was ready to speak. "I used to be brave," I whispered. "Before him, I used to fight back." "You're still fighting." He moved to the chair beside my bed, settling into it with fluid grace. "Running was fighting. Surviving was fighting. Being here, letting yourself heal. That's fighting too. It doesn't feel like fighting. It feels like hiding. Sometimes hiding is the smartest strategy." His smile was slight but genuine. "Even generals retreat when they're outnumbered." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of his presence somehow making the shadows less threatening. Outside, I could hear the guards making their rounds, their footsteps a steady rhythm that spoke of protection rather than imprisonment. "Victor," I said finally. "Yes?" "You frighten me." He went very still. "I know, but I feel safe with you. How is that possible?" For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Because sometimes the only thing that can protect you from one monster is another monster." The words should have terrified me. Instead, they felt like the first honest thing anyone had said to me in years. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself and settled back against the pillows, my eyes never leaving his face. "Will you stay?" I asked. "Just until I fall asleep?" He nodded once, a sharp movement that somehow conveyed both agreement and something deeper. A promise, perhaps, or a vow. I closed my eyes and let myself drift, lulled by the steady rhythm of his breathing and the knowledge that someone was watching over me. Someone who understood that sometimes safety came wrapped in danger, and that the most frightening protector was often the most effective one. For the first time since receiving Caleb's message, I slept without dreams. A week in Victor's house had given me something I'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. Not happiness. I wasn't naive enough to confuse safety with joy. But for the first time in 3 years, I woke each morning without immediately cataloging potential threats. I ate meals without calculating escape routes. The bruises on my face had faded to yellow shadows, and I'd caught glimpses of the woman I used to be in mirrors. Still too thin, still too careful, but alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I was reading in the library when my old life came crashing back. The book was Jane Eyre, and I was lost in Bronte's prose when I heard it. A soft buzz from across the room, coming from the small purse I'd carried the night I ran. The sound came again, insistent, electronic. My blood turned to ice as I realized what it was. A phone, but not my phone. I'd thrown that in a dumpster 3 blocks from the apartment. This was something else, something I'd never seen before. With trembling hands, I opened the purse and found a cheap burner phone tucked beneath my old wallet. The screen showed a single text message from an unknown number. "I found you." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor. The walls seemed to close in around me, the beautiful room transforming into a trap. He'd found me. Somehow, impossibly, Caleb had found me. I sank to my knees, my body remembering every lesson he'd taught me about pain. The way his fist felt when it connected with my ribs, the sound his belt made when he pulled it from its loops. "Jessika?" Victor's voice cut through my panic like a blade. I looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp concern as he took in my state. In 3 quick strides, he was beside me. "What happened?" I couldn't speak, could barely think. I just pointed at the phone lying on the floor, its screen still glowing with Caleb's message. Victor picked it up, his face going completely still as he read the text. For a moment, the mask of control he always wore slipped, and I saw something that made my blood freeze. Fury so pure and cold it was like looking into the heart of a glacier. "How long has this been in your bag?" His voice was deadly quiet. "I don't know. I didn't know it was there." He was already moving, pulling his own phone from his pocket and speaking in rapid Russian. Within seconds, the library filled with his men. Dmitri appeared first, followed by 2 others I'd seen patrolling the grounds. "Lock down the house," Victor commanded, switching to English. "Full security protocol, and find out how long that phone has been active." "Sir." Dmitri nodded and began speaking into his earpiece. Victor turned back to me, his expression softening slightly. "When did you last go through your bag thoroughly?" "The night I ran." My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. I just grabbed it and... The realization hit me like a physical blow. He put it there, before I left. He knew I would run, and he wanted to be able to find me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victor's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the promise of violence. "He won't touch you again." The words were steel wrapped in silk, and I believed them completely. But belief didn't stop the terror clawing at my chest. "He's coming," I whispered. "He always comes. Let him." Victor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'll be waiting." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Victor's house transformed from a peaceful estate into a fortress. Additional guards appeared as if from nowhere, taking positions around the property with military precision. I watched it all from the safety of the library, feeling like a spectator at my own execution. "The phone was activated 6 days ago." Dmitri reported during one of their briefings. He's been tracking her location since she arrived. 6 days. Caleb had known where I was for almost a week, had been watching and waiting while I'd foolishly allowed myself to feel safe. Any movement on his end? Victor asked. Our contacts in the police department report he filed a missing persons report yesterday, claims his wife was kidnapped. Victor's laugh was devoid of humor. Clever. What else do we know about him? Marcus Webb's operation is small but growing. Caleb Faust handles enforcement, collections, intimidation. He's violent but undisciplined. More useful as a blunt instrument than a strategist. I listened to them discuss my husband like he was a business problem to be solved, and part of me was grateful for their clinical detachment. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. The wind against the windows, the settling of the old house, the distant murmur of guards making their rounds. When I finally drifted off near dawn, the nightmares came immediately. I was back in our apartment, but it was wrong somehow. The walls stretched impossibly high, the rooms connected in ways that defied logic. Caleb was hunting me through the maze of corridors, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. You can't hide from me, Jessika. You're mine. You'll always be mine. I ran through endless hallways, my bare feet slipping on floors that seemed to shift beneath me. Behind me, his footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sound of his belt sliding through its loops. Found you. His hand closed around my wrist, and I screamed, Jessika! I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The room was dark except for the security lights filtering through the curtains. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, couldn't separate dream from reality. Then I saw him. Victor stood near the window, perfectly still, watching me with those winter blue eyes. He was fully dressed despite the early hour, and something in his posture suggested he'd been there for a while. You were dreaming, he said quietly. I sat up, pulling the blanket around myself like armor. How long have you been there? Long enough. He moved closer, and I caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and understated that somehow made me feel safer. You called out his name. Shame flooded through me, even in sleep. Even here in Victor's fortress, Caleb still had power over me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize. Victor's voice was gentle but firm. Fear is a reasonable response to a real threat. But you said he couldn't touch me. He can't. The certainty in his voice was absolute. But that doesn't erase what he's already done. Healing takes time. I studied his face in the dim light, searching for some sign of impatience or judgment. But Victor simply waited, as patient as stone. I used to be brave, I whispered. Before him. I used to fight back. You're still fighting. He moved to the chair beside my bed, settling into it with fluid grace. Running was fighting. Surviving was fighting. Being here, letting yourself heal. That's fighting too. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of his presence somehow making the shadows less threatening. Victor, I said finally. Yes? You frighten me. He went very still. I know. But I feel safe with you. How is that possible? For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear it. Because sometimes the only thing that can protect you from one monster is another monster. The words should have terrified me. Instead, they felt like the first honest thing anyone had said to me in years. Will you stay? I asked. Just until I fall asleep? He nodded once, a sharp movement that somehow conveyed both agreement and something deeper, a promise, perhaps, or a vow. I closed my eyes and let myself drift, lulled by the steady rhythm of his breathing and the knowledge that someone was watching over me. Someone who understood that sometimes safety came wrapped in danger, and that the most frightening protector was often the most effective one. For the first time since receiving Caleb's message, I slept without dreams. 2 days passed in tense quiet. Victor's men moved through the house like shadows, their presence both comforting and ominous. I caught glimpses of them checking windows, testing locks, speaking in hushed tones into their earpieces. The estate had become a fortress, and I was both its treasure and its prisoner. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but every unexpected sound made me jump. Every shadow in my peripheral vision made my heart race. Victor had become a constant, reassuring presence. He worked from his office during the day, but I often found him nearby, reading in the library while I browsed the shelves, taking coffee in the breakfast room when I came down for meals. On the third night, the waiting ended. I was in my room when the security lights outside suddenly blazed to life. The change was so dramatic, it was like daylight had erupted in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, I heard shouting. Harsh, angry voices that made my blood freeze. One of those voices was Caleb's. I dropped my book and ran to the window. The grounds were lit up like a stage, and I could see figures moving near the main gate. Security guards in dark suits, their weapons drawn, surrounding a lone figure who was gesticulating wildly. Even at this distance, I recognized him immediately. The way he held his shoulders when he was angry, the aggressive stance that preceded his worst rages. He'd found me. No, 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 I whispered, backing away from the window. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not in the one place I'd felt safe. The door to my room burst open, and Victor strode in, his face a mask of cold fury. Behind him came Dmitri and 2 other guards, all moving with the fluid precision of soldiers preparing for battle. "Stay away from the windows," Victor commanded. "Dmitri, get her to the safe room." "No." The word tore from my throat before I could stop it. "I won't hide anymore." Victor's eyes snapped to mine, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. "Jessika, he's here because of me." My voice was steadier than I felt. "I need to see this." Outside, Caleb's voice rose to a roar. "I know she's in there. That's my wife. You can't keep her from me." The sound of his rage sent ice through my veins, but I forced myself to stand straighter. I'd spent 3 years cowering from that voice. Not tonight. "He has a gun," Dmitri reported. "Appears to be intoxicated, making threats." Victor's jaw tightened. "How did he get past the outer perimeter?" "Came through the service road, abandoned his vehicle about half a mile out." "I want my wife!" Caleb screamed, and I heard the distinctive sound of a gun being fired into the air. "I want what's mine!" The words hit me like physical blows. What's mine? Not who I love. What's mine? Property to be reclaimed. "Enough," Victor said quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. "I'm ending this." He started toward the door, but I caught his arm. The contact sent electricity through my fingertips, the first time I'd voluntarily touched him. "Don't kill him," I said, the words surprising me. "Why?" His question was genuinely curious. "Because then I'll never be free of him. He'll always be the man who died because of me." Victor studied my face for a long moment, those winter blue eyes searching. Finally, he nodded once. "Stay here," he commanded. "Whatever happens, don't come downstairs." He left with his men, and I pressed myself against the wall beside the window, close enough to see but hopefully hidden from view. What happened next unfolded like a scene from a movie, beautiful and terrible and utterly surreal. Victor emerged from the house alone, walking across the illuminated grounds with calm confidence. He wore no coat despite the cold, and his hands were empty of weapons. But something in his posture made him more intimidating than any of his armed guards. Caleb saw him coming and raised his gun, a cheap pistol that shook in his unsteady grip. "Stay back! I just want my wife." Victor didn't slow down, didn't even acknowledge the weapon pointed at his chest. He simply walked forward with that same measured pace. "You made a mistake," Victor said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "You hurt what's mine." "She's not yours," Caleb's voice cracked with desperation. "She's my wife." "Marriage is a contract," Victor replied, still walking forward. "Contracts can be broken." He was close enough now that Caleb could hardly miss if he pulled the trigger. But something in Victor's absolute calm seemed to be unraveling my husband's resolve. "I'll kill you," Caleb threatened, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Victor said simply. "You won't." What happened next was so fast I almost missed it. Victor moved like liquid lightning, one hand deflecting the gun while the other struck Caleb's wrist with surgical precision. The pistol went flying, and Caleb dropped to his knees with a scream of pain. Victor stood over him, completely composed, as his guards moved in with practiced efficiency, securing the weapon and restraining Caleb. "You broke into my home," Victor said conversationally, "threatened my people, disturbed my peace." "She's my wife," Caleb whimpered, all his earlier bravado gone. "I have rights." "You had rights," Victor corrected. "You forfeited them when you raised your hand to her." He gestured to his men, and they hauled Caleb to his feet. My husband looked smaller somehow, diminished by his defeat. For 3 years, he'd been the monster in my nightmares. Now he looked like what he'd always been, a weak man who used violence to feel strong. "What are you going to do with me?" Caleb asked, genuine fear in his voice. Victor smiled, and the expression was sharp enough to cut glass. "That depends on you." He leaned closer, speaking too quietly for me to hear. But whatever he said made Caleb's face go white with terror. My husband nodded frantically, agreeing to terms I couldn't imagine. Then Victor straightened and walked back toward the house, leaving his men to deal with the aftermath. When Victor appeared in my doorway minutes later, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to process what I'd witnessed. "It's over," he said simply. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." Victor's expression was unreadable. "That if he ever comes near you again, I'll make him disappear." The casual certainty in his voice should have terrified me. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete safety. "And he believed you?" "Men like your husband are cowards at heart. They only prey on those weaker than themselves." Victor's smile was cold. "I am not weaker than him." I stood up slowly. "Is he alive? For now. That was your choice, and I honored it." He paused. "But if he breaks our agreement, that choice will be taken out of your hands." I nodded, understanding. Victor had given Caleb one chance to walk away. If my husband was smart, he'd take it. "Thank you," I whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Victor replied. "This was just the beginning." Caleb didn't disappear that night. I learned this the next morning when I found Victor in his office, speaking in low, measured Russian into one of his encrypted phones. Through the partially open door, I caught fragments of conversation, locations, time frames. instructions delivered with the same calm precision he used for everything else. When he noticed me hovering in the doorway, he ended the call and gestured for me to enter. "You kept him alive," I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "For now." Victor's expression was unreadable. "He's being held at one of my facilities, a warehouse in the industrial district." The casual way he said it, "one of my facilities," reminded me again of the world I'd stumbled into. Victor didn't just own this mansion, this estate. He owned pieces of the city itself, carved out territories where his word was law. "Why?" I asked. "You could have ended it last night." "Because killing him immediately would have been inefficient." Victor leaned back in his chair, studying me with those winter blue eyes. "Your husband worked for Marcus Webb. Webb has been cutting into my territory for months, using men like Caleb to intimidate my clients, disrupt my operations. Last night wasn't just about you, Jessika. It was about sending a message." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What kind of message?" "That actions have consequences, that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed." His smile was sharp as a blade. "Caleb will be released in a few days, broken but breathing. He'll return to Webb with stories about what happens to men who threaten what's mine. Webb will think twice before making his next move." The calculated nature of it should have horrified me. Instead, I found myself oddly fascinated by the chess game Victor was playing, moves and counter-moves, each action designed to achieve multiple objectives. "And if Caleb doesn't stay away?" "Then the message becomes permanent." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between us. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of the estate. Gardeners working, staff moving through the halls, the distant hum of security systems. Life continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Last night had shattered the last illusion that this was temporary, that I could somehow return to the life I'd known before. There was no going back now, only forward into whatever Victor's world held. "You're thinking too hard," Victor observed, his voice gentler than usual. "I'm trying to understand." I met his gaze directly. "You. This. Why you're helping me." Something flickered across his features. Too quick to interpret, but it looked almost like pain. He was quiet for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "I had a wife. Once." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I was only beginning to grasp. "Her name was Alina," he continued, his gaze shifting to the window overlooking the grounds. Beautiful, intelligent, fierce. She had this way of looking at the world, like she could see possibilities others missed. I waited, sensing that this was a story he'd never told before, or at least not often. "We met when I was building my organization, consolidating power in the city. She was a translator, spoke 6 languages fluently. I hired her for a business meeting and she—" He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "She corrected my Russian grammar in front of a room full of my lieutenants." Despite everything, I found myself smiling at the image. "That must have been interesting." "Terrifying," Victor admitted. "No one had dared challenge me like that in years. But she wasn't afraid. She saw the man beneath the reputation, and somehow she decided he was worth saving." The past tense wasn't lost on me. "What happened to her?" The smile faded from his face, replaced by something darker. "She tried to leave me." The words were simple, but the pain behind them was anything but. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands stilled on the desk. The violence that surrounded my life, It wore on her. The constant security, the threats, the knowledge that people died because of decisions I made. She started having nightmares, jumping at shadows. I told myself it would pass, that she would adapt. But she didn't. No, she became more and more withdrawn, more frightened, and He paused, his expression hardening. I became more controlling, more possessive. I told myself I was protecting her, but really I was protecting myself. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her. I could see where this was heading, and my heart began to ache for both of them. The woman who'd been trapped by love and fear, and the man who'd been too blind to see what his protection was costing her. The night she died, she'd been planning to leave, Victor continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She'd packed a bag, hidden it in the closet. She was going to wait until I was away on business, then disappear. How do you know? Because I found the bag afterward, along with a letter she'd written but never sent. His hands clenched into fists. She wrote that she loved me, but she couldn't live in a cage anymore, even a golden one. The parallel to my own situation wasn't lost on me. The beautiful house, the protection that felt like imprisonment, the man who claimed to care but controlled everything around him. What happened that night? Rival gang. They'd been watching the house, waiting for an opportunity. They knew about Alina, knew she was my weakness. Victor's voice turned cold, distant. They broke in while I was at a meeting across town. By the time my men reached her, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. She died because I couldn't let her go, because I thought I knew what was best for her. He looked at me directly then, and I saw something raw and broken in his eyes. You remind me of her. How? Not your face, your fire. His voice was soft, almost reverent. The way you stood up to me in the garden, the way you refused to hide last night. Alina had that same strength, that same refusal to be diminished. Understanding hit me like a physical blow. That's why you're helping me. Not because you're good, but because you're guilty. Victor didn't deny it. Guilt is a powerful motivator. And you think protecting me will somehow make up for failing to protect her? I think, he said carefully, that everyone deserves the chance to choose their own path, even if that choice leads them away from safety. The admission hung between us, heavy with implication. He was telling me that if I wanted to leave, he would let me go, even if it meant losing another woman to his own inability to love without controlling. What if I choose to stay? Something shifted in his expression, hope, maybe, or fear. Then you stay, but not as a prisoner, Jessika. Not as someone who needs to be protected from the world. As what then? As someone who chooses to be here. Someone who understands what this world is and decides it's worth the risk. I studied his face, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the cold, controlled mafia boss who commanded fear and respect. Not the mysterious protector who'd saved me from my husband's violence. But a man haunted by his own ghosts, trying to find redemption in the choices he made now. You're not the only one with ghosts, I said quietly. No, he agreed. But maybe that's what makes us understand each other. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grounds. In a few hours, Caleb would spend another night in Victor's warehouse, learning what it meant to be powerless. In a few days, he would be released with a message that would ripple through the city's underworld. But here, in this office, with the weight of Victor's confession settling between us, I realized that the most dangerous thing about this man wasn't his capacity for violence. It was his capacity for love, and the lengths he would go to protect what he loved, even if it destroyed them both. The question was whether I was brave enough to find out if this time could be different. 3 days later, Caleb was gone. I didn't see him leave. Victor's men handled that part with their usual efficiency, but I felt his absence like a weight lifting from my chest. A tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying finally releasing its grip. "It's done," Victor told me over breakfast, his voice matter-of-fact as he buttered his toast. "He's been released with clear instructions about the consequences of returning." I set down my coffee cup, studying his face. "What did you do to him?" "Nothing permanent. A few broken ribs, some bruised pride, enough to make the message clear without making him a martyr." Victor's expression was unreadable. "He'll live, but he'll remember." The casual way he discussed violence, clinical, efficient, devoid of emotion, should have horrified me. Instead, I found myself struggling with a more complex reaction. Relief that Caleb was gone, gratitude that Victor had kept his word about not killing him, and underneath it all, a growing unease about what I was becoming in this world. "Does it ever bother you?" I asked. "What?" "The violence. The way you solve problems with fear and pain." Victor paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Are you asking if I feel guilty about hurting the man who terrorized you for 3 years? "I'm asking if you feel anything at all." The question hung between us, sharper than I'd intended. Victor set down his cup and leaned back in his chair, those winter blue eyes studying me with renewed interest. "You're having second thoughts," he observed. "I'm having thoughts, period." I pushed my plate away, my appetite gone. For 3 years, I lived in a world where violence was the answer to everything, where might made right, and the strong preyed on the weak. I thought I'd escaped that. And now you realize you've simply traded one cage for another? His words stung because they contained a grain of truth I didn't want to acknowledge. "Haven't I?" Victor was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the window overlooking his perfectly manicured grounds. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd rarely heard from him. "In my world, there's no law that protects the good. The police can be bought, judges can be threatened, and justice is a luxury the innocent can't afford." He looked back at me, his expression serious. "So I became the law." "Whose law? By what right?" "By the right of necessity." His voice hardened slightly. "By the right of someone who was tired of watching predators feast on the helpless." I stared at him, seeing something I'd missed before. Beneath the cold control, beneath the calculated violence, there was something that looked almost like idealism. Twisted, perhaps, but genuine. "You really believe that, don't you? That you're some kind of protector?" "I believe that the world is full of men like your husband, men who take what they want and hurt anyone who tries to stop them. And I believe that sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become something more monstrous." The conviction in his voice was absolute, and I found myself caught between admiration and revulsion. He wasn't a sociopath who enjoyed violence for its own sake. He was something more complex, a man who had chosen to become a weapon in service of his own twisted sense of justice. "And what about the innocent people who get caught in the crossfire?" "I try to minimize collateral damage." "Try?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's your moral framework? You try?" Victor's expression darkened. "Don't lecture me about morality, Jessika. Not when you're sitting in my house, eating my food, protected by my violence. You may not like my methods, but you've certainly benefited from them." The words hit like a slap, partly because they were true. I had benefited from his violence. Caleb was gone because Victor had been willing to do what the law wouldn't, or couldn't do. You're right, I said quietly. I am a hypocrite. I want the protection without the guilt, the safety without the cost. Most people do. But I'm not most people, am I? Not anymore. I met his gaze directly. Being here, in your world, it's changing me, and I don't know if that's good or bad. Change isn't inherently good or bad. It just is. Victor leaned forward, his voice gentling. The question is whether you can live with who you're becoming. I considered that, turning the question over in my mind. Who was I becoming? A woman who could watch her husband be beaten and feel relief instead of horror. Someone who could accept protection from a man who solved problems with violence. A person who was starting to understand that sometimes the world was too dark for clean hands and clear consciences. I don't know, I admitted, but I know I can't go back to who I was before. No, Victor agreed. You can't. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken truth settling between us. Outside, I could see his guards making their rounds, maintaining the security that kept this bubble of safety intact. Everything here ran on Victor's will, his power, his capacity for violence, and I was part of it now, whether I liked it or not. Victor, I said finally. Yes? Why haven't you... I struggled to find the words. We've been living in the same house for weeks. You've seen me at my worst, my most vulnerable. You could have taken advantage of that. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. Is that what you think of me? I don't know what to think of you. You're capable of terrible things, but you've been nothing but gentle with me. You command absolute loyalty from dangerous men, but you ask my permission before making decisions that affect me. I paused, searching his face. I don't understand you. I'm drawn to you, he said quietly, the admission seeming to surprise him as much as it did me. More than I should be. More than is wise. Then why? Because I won't be another man who takes what he wants from you without asking. His voice was firm, resolute. You've had enough of that for one lifetime. The simple honesty of it took my breath away. Here was a man who could have anything he wanted through force or manipulation, choosing instead to wait for permission he might never receive. What if I said I was tired of being told what's best for me? I asked. By anyone? Then I'd say you have every right to make your own choices, even if they're mistakes. And if I chose you, knowing what you are, what your world is, Victor went very still. Then I'd ask if you were certain, because once you cross that line, there's no going back to innocence. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it, the moment that would define everything that came after. I could walk away, ask him to arrange safe passage to somewhere far from here. Start over with a clean slate and clear conscience. Or I could step forward into the darkness, accepting all the moral compromises that came with it. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. The contact was electric, not passion, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or acceptance. His skin was warm, his fingers strong and steady. These were hands that had dealt death, but they were also hands that had protected me when no one else would. I'm certain, I said quietly. Victor turned his hand palm up, his fingers intertwining with mine. Jessika, I'm tired of being afraid, I interrupted. Tired of being a victim. Tired of letting other people decide what I can and can't handle. This world will change you. I'm already changed. I squeezed his hand. The question is whether I'll let that change destroy me or make me stronger." He studied my face for a long moment, searching for doubt or hesitation. When he found none, something in his expression softened. "If we do this," he said carefully, "it has to be real. Not gratitude, not dependence. Choice. It is choice." He stood slowly, still holding my hand, and moved around the table until he was standing in front of me. This close, I could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes, the faint lines that spoke of years spent making impossible decisions. "Are you sure?" he asked one more time. Instead of answering with words, I reached up and touched his face. His skin was warm beneath my palm, and I felt him lean into the contact like a man starved for gentle touch. When he kissed me, it was nothing like I'd expected. Not demanding or possessive, but careful, questioning, as if he were asking permission with every breath. I kissed him back, and it felt like stepping off a cliff into free fall, terrifying and exhilarating and utterly irreversible. When we broke apart, his forehead rested against mine, and I could feel his breath against my lips. "No going back," he whispered. "No going back," I agreed. And for the first time since running into that alley, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 6 weeks later, I stood behind the counter of Between the Lines, a small bookstore tucked into a quiet corner of downtown Detroit. The afternoon sun streamed through the front windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The smell of old paper and fresh coffee from the cafe next door had become as familiar as breathing. To anyone watching, I was simply Jessika, no last name needed, the quiet woman who'd taken over managing the store when the previous owner retired. I helped customers find their next great read, organized author events, and balanced the books with meticulous care. It was peaceful work, honest work, the kind of life I dreamed of during my darkest moments with Caleb. What the customers didn't know was that Between the Lines served a dual purpose. In the back office, behind locked doors and encrypted computers, Victor's accountants moved money through carefully constructed networks. The bookstore's modest profits were supplemented by funds that had traveled through a dozen countries and twice as many shell companies before arriving clean and untraceable. I knew this, of course. Victor had been honest about what the business really was when he offered me the position, but somehow the knowledge didn't bother me the way I thought it should. The books were real, the customers were real, and the peace I found in this small corner of his empire was real too. "Jessika?" Sarah, my part-time assistant, poked her head out from the children's section. "Mrs. Chen is here for her book club order." I smiled and reached for the box I'd prepared that morning, 12 copies of The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, carefully wrapped and ready for distribution. Mrs. Chen had been coming to the store for 3 years, and her book club was one of our most reliable customers. "Perfect timing," I told her as she approached the counter. "I think your group is going to love this one." "You always know exactly what we need," Mrs. Chen said, counting out exact change with the precision of someone who'd been managing household budgets for decades. "Same time next month? I'll have your next selection ready." After she left, I found myself alone in the store for the first time all day. The quiet was comfortable now, no longer the oppressive silence that had once made me jump at shadows. I moved through the familiar routine of closing, counting the register, straightening shelves, checking that the back office was secure. My phone buzzed with a text from Victor. "Dinner at 8. I have news." I typed back, "Good news or bad news? Depends on your perspective." That was Victor, never giving away more than necessary, even in casual conversation. But I'd learned to read the subtle cues in his messages, and this one didn't carry the weight of genuine concern. Whatever his news was, it wasn't a crisis. I locked up the store and walked the 6 blocks to Victor's downtown penthouse, a sleek glass tower that rose above the city like a modern cathedral. The doorman knew me by sight now, greeting me with the same respectful nod he gave all of Victor's associates. In the elevator, I watched the city shrink below me, the streets and buildings becoming a grid of lights in the gathering dusk. Victor was waiting in the living room when I arrived, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Detroit's skyline. He'd traded his usual suit for dark jeans and a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up in a way that made him look younger, more approachable. "How was the store today?" he asked, turning as I entered. "Busy." Mrs. Chen picked up her book club order, and we sold 3 copies of that new thriller you recommended. I set my purse on the side table and moved to join him at the window. "What's your news?" Victor was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Caleb's body was found this morning, in the river, near the old steel plant." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though part of me had been expecting them. I'd known, from the moment Victor released him, that my husband was living on borrowed time. Men like Caleb didn't learn from warnings. They festered and plotted and eventually made the kind of mistake that couldn't be forgiven. "Suicide?" I asked, though we both knew better. "That's what the police report will say. Despondent over his missing wife, struggling with alcohol and debt. He left a note." I didn't ask if Victor had written the note himself. Some questions were better left unasked. "When?" 3 days ago. It took time for the body to surface." 3 days. While I'd been helping customers find their next great escape, while I'd been learning to laugh again, while I'd been building something that felt like a real life, Caleb had been floating face down in the Detroit River. I should have felt something. Grief, maybe, or guilt. Relief, certainly. But all I felt was a strange kind of emptiness, as if a chapter of my life had finally closed and I was still processing what came next. "Are you all right?" Victor asked, his voice gentle. "I don't know." I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window. "I thought I'd feel different when it was over. More something." "What did you expect to feel? Free, maybe? Or guilty? Or relieved?" I shook my head. "Not this. Nothing. Sometimes the end of something isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet." Outside, rain began to fall. The same kind of steady drizzle that had been falling the night I ran from Caleb, the night I stumbled into Victor's car and changed the course of my life forever. I watched the droplets race down the glass, each one following its own path to the bottom. "Just temporary," I whispered, the old mantra rising unbidden to my lips. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true anymore. The rain was temporary. The fear was temporary. The uncertainty that had defined so much of my life, that was temporary too. "No," I corrected myself softly. "This time, it's peace." Behind me, I heard Victor move closer, felt the warmth of his presence at my back. "No cages," he said quietly. "Only choices. You're free, Jessika." I turned to face him, meeting those winter blue eyes that had once seemed so cold and now held nothing but warmth. For the first time since I'd known him, I didn't flinch from his gaze, didn't look away or down or anywhere but directly at him. "I know," I said, and meant it. He reached up to touch my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheek where Caleb's last bruise had finally faded completely. "What will you choose?" I leaned into his touch, feeling the solid reality of his hand against my skin. "This," I said simply. "I choose this." When he kissed me, it was different from that first careful kiss in his breakfast room. This was deeper, more certain. The kiss of two people who had found each other in the darkness and decided to build something together in the light. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't counting the minutes until it stopped.